Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to another episode of Voices for Excellence. I am your host, Dr. Michael Connor, CEO and founder of the Agile Evolutionary Group and proud host of VFE. I want to be the first to tell you, happy Black History Month, and we are starting to officially kick off our Black Excellence series, and I wanted to bring in a special guest who I just have admired for a long standing of time. He is one of the titans in education. I was just talking to Dr. Noguera. I haven't seen him in a while. This was going back to about 2009, 2010. I'll never forget this, Dr. Noguera. I wrote you an email.
Wow.
It was when you were at NYU, and I was just about to start writing my lit review. And I was reading a couple of your books, and I really wanted to go in depth with it. And Dr. Noguera, I emailed you, figured that you weren't going to email me back. You emailed me back, and I said, all right, let me email him back, and let me see if I can get a meeting with him. I got a meeting with Dr. Noguera at NYU, and that was so long ago. So when we talk about accessibility to some of the smartest, or one of the smartest, in my opinion, the smartest minds in education. It is just an absolute honor to open up the Black Excellence Series with the Dean of Education for the USC School of Rosier Education. Did I say it correctly?
Yeah, Rossier.
Yep, Rossier. Yep, Rossier School of Education at the University of Southern California. A warm welcome to Dr. Pedro Noguera. Dr. Noguera, such an honor. How are you?
I'm great. It's a pleasure being with you, Michael. Thanks for inviting me to appear with you on this program.
Absolutely. And I use this platform, Dr. Noguera, as an asynchronous professional learning platform to deepen and strengthen leadership andragogy for our leaders that participate or that tune into my podcast. So please, Dr. Noguera, this will be an honor to have you unwrap the research, the theory, and also the leading practices in education so we can reach sustainable, equitable systems.
All right.
All right. But Dr. Noguera, this first question is a fun question, okay? And when researchers, economists, sociologists, and educational stakeholders unpack the work of Dr. Pedro Noguera or participate in a class or a keynote session with you, what song comes to mind to describe your leadership signature within the field of education?
That was I saw the question, and it's actually challenging for me. So on a number of occasions, I'm asked when I go to speak if there's a theme song that I like to use, and it's almost always Bob Marley. I like to song, let's get together and it'll be all right, and because I like to be positive. But I would say that to my critics, what probably is the song that comes to their minds is "Here He Comes Again," right? Because I've been pretty consistent over the years of raising certain issues about the need to pursue equity and what gets in the way of that. And I think that although at times that message resonates for the people who don't agree with me, I think that to them sounds like I've been beating the same drum for a long time.
Dr. Noguera, I love it. Here he comes again. Can't forget Bob Marley. Love Bob Marley, right? Let's get together. Everything's going to be okay. But here he comes. And when I think about that, right, the coalition of educational leaders, transformative leaders who underpin and underscore equity as a core throughput within their practices. Yes, here they come again, right? You hear kind of like the rhetoric, I should say, of how equity is polarized, how it is politicized. But again, in order for us to pursue this level of equitable systems and creating learning environments that are culturally responsive, we have to keep coming again, Dr. Noguera. Absolutely. So, Dr. Noguera, you have, I'm telling you, everybody has written, yes, everybody has used your work in their literature review. Everyone I talk to has used their work use your work in their literature review. But When we look at the post-pandemic era, I like to call it the AC stage of education after COVID-19. What are the core priorities needed in the context of leadership to achieve equity and excellence for all?
Well, I always get concerned that when we use these terms, they will become nothing more than a slogan,
Mm.
and that the substance of it gets lost. And so, if you think about No Child Left Behind, No Child Left Behind was a policy that we thought would lead to all children getting what they need. But as we know, millions of children were left behind. And that's because we still have great inequities in our schools. If you live in a affluent community, you tend to have schools that are well resourced. You live in a poor community, that's typically not the case. And that's true throughout America. Um, in our cities, the wealthy go to private schools, the poor go to public schools. These are the patterns we see all over, and we accept it as normal. And then we wonder why our society stays so fragmented, why poverty stays so entrenched, why achievement gaps remain unchanged. And, it's a direct byproduct of the inequities in the way we support education in this country. So, um, I think that if we're going to make the pursuit of equity and excellence real, then we have to start by asking, what do children need? And what are we going to do to deliver those needs? There was a report in the New York Times today about a study done by a group called Common Sense Media. And what they did is a poll of kids and families about how they think about education and their future. And the results are quite depressing, because a lot of young people are feeling pretty hopeless right now about the future. Feel like the political system isn't working for them. Feel like the the threats to their ability to live even as well as their parents are great. Mental health needs are rising. Um, and so, to the degree that schools cannot respond to these kinds of issues, schools become irrelevant to kids. And I think and it's not just K-12 schools, it's higher education as well. And I think we're in a place right now where we have to really examine what we're doing and ask ourselves, are we addressing the needs of our students right now, knowing that those needs are not simply academic, they're also social, emotional, psychological, and even in a certain way, spiritual.
Yeah, and Dr. Noguera, great point that you highlighted. I want to touch upon the question, right, of what do children need? And when we look at the needs of our students and using, let's say that great inequities or equity is becoming a slogan, how can we now lament these practices or continuously to ask these complex and hard questions around what do children need so equity won't become a slogan where it becomes realized in our learning organizations throughout the country.
So, it doesn't take a whole lot of research to know that hungry kids don't do well in school,
Yeah.
that kids who are poorly housed won't do that well in school, that kids who haven't seen an eye doctor will have trouble reading, that basic needs impact learning. But we don't have a strategy to address those needs. And so consequently, what we see in our schools is that the kids with the greatest needs do least well. And it tends to be we give those schools that serve those kids the least in the way of resources. So we compound the problem. And then on top of all that, we assign, that they don't always get the best teachers. They don't always get the best facilities. So instead of education being a pathway to a better life, for too many people, education reproduces the same inequities that we've seen. And that's what we really have to challenge. How do we make education live up to its potential to serve as a means for people to, pursue a better life, to get the opportunities that are available in this country?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Noguera. And I remember in a keynote speech that you were given, you talked about if a student's basic needs are not met, he or she will not learn. It goes back to your empirical research around structural factors and external factors, examining external factors, emulation around the economy. When I look at external factors and structural factors, influential factors that impact achievement. So, Dr. Noguera, in a recent interview that I saw you in, you highlighted that authentic engagement is the pathway to achievement. Now, because of the pandemic, we have accelerated into the digital age paradigm with the exponential rise of AI and emerging technologies. Now, Dr. Noguera, if you can you define engagement with AI, and how can leaders create this multivariate strategy that invites agency and engagement?
So I've been actually writing a number of editorials recently about artificial intelligence, both in terms of the threat it creates as well as the potential it creates as a tool. Right now, I'm particularly concerned about the threats because, as we know, the technology is being released and made available faster than our ability to control it. So I want you to think about this for a moment. Forms of artificial intelligence have been around for a long time. Think about spell check, GPS. One of the things we know about these kinds of technology is that they can make you lazy, right? There are a lot of people can't get home without GPS anymore because they rely on it. There are a lot of people that can't spell, but they need spell check. They can't. They don't. A lot of people. If you ask them what's your children's phone number, they don't know because it's in their phone. Right. So, in fact, they call it kind of digital memory loss. Yeah. When you get too used to the technology, you don't use the part of the brain that you once relied on, right? And with generative AI that can help you with writing and all other forms of creativity, yeah, we run the risk of another generation that become even lazier because they'll rely on these tools, which will then prevent them from developing those skills and that knowledge themselves. So that is the fear I have right now. Yeah. On the other side, I see the potential for AI as a tool. We're seeing that AI can be used to provide teachers with guidance on how to meet the needs of individual students. You know, you think about it, the typical teacher might have 30 students in the class. How do you give feedback to each student without being overwhelmed just by the amount of grading you have to do? Well, AI tools can help with that. Mm-hmm. So there are ways in which AI can enhance what we do in education, but what we need to make sure is that we're not doing what I just described, over-relying on it in ways that actually weaken us.
Great point, Dr. Noguera. You talked about AI been around. I remember in I was reading something, 1956, John McCarthy defined what AI is. And when you talk about digital memory loss, right, and looking at Generation Z and Generation Alpha, because of generative AI, I think there is, or it could be this is more of a hypothesis, that students right now, Generation Alpha, Generation Z, they won't have to have a primary focus with coding because generative AI will be able to do the coding for them. Compelling. And when you talk about generative AI, we know these large language models within that. I just recently heard that they're creating small language models to be able to help, let's say, special education, EL departments become more efficient, and then providing recommendations with that. So I think that will be coming out within the next 6 to 8 months of what I heard. I don't know, but I know that they're working on these small language models. Now, Dr. Noguera, when we talk about digital memory loss, right? There's this compelling sentiment that we always hear in education, and I just want your perspective of this, is that there is a fear that AI and generative AI, also emergent technologies, will replace the classroom practitioner. Now, you highlighted some of the success points that AI can bring. But can you dispel that misnomer? And what is that? I like to say reciprocity, right? Mining the gap between humans and machines, but looking at it from a practitioner and AI. How do we mine the gap to ensure that there's that level of synergy and to dispel that misnomer that AI is going to take over everything?
I'm not sure yet. We're trying to figure it out. In the hands of an expert, someone who has expert knowledge, AI can be a very effective tool. So for example, if I'm writing something, I might use AI to help me figure out, okay, what are some ways in which I could approach studying giraffes? Right? And AI will generate a bunch of ideas. Well, giraffes is probably not a good example because I'm not expert on giraffes. Say schools in LA.
Uh-huh.
But I can look at it and I can easily figure out what of what they've given me is useful, what's not useful. I don't accept it all because I know enough about the subject to know that not everything that they produced from mining the data is useful or even accurate.
Yeah.
I'm a novice user. I wouldn't know that, right?
Right.
And that's the danger, right? We have a lot of students who, still learning, don't know much, and could easily rely a lot on AI. And we're seeing it now in colleges. That's why some colleges try to ban it, where they'll, use it to write a paper, and they don't even realize that some of the sources in there are bogus sources.
Right.
And so I think it's really a question of how it's used and by whom. In the hands, again, of an expert, it can be very effective. In the hands of a novice, it could not only make you lazy, it could also contribute to plagiarism, inaccuracies, and other problems.
Thank you, Dr. Noguera, for your perspective on that. I love how you said it's ongoing, right? And it's validated learning, right? We're going to continue to experiment. We're going to continue to interrogate, research, and then put in practice and learn from that.
Yeah.
But from a commercial insight lens, Dr. Noguera, there are compounding influential factors that I believe is forgotten when we think about or talk about school quality or even district quality. You have been one of the leading voices in education to curtail and combat poverty and homelessness. You stated in a keynote speech again that if a student's basic needs are not met, they're not going to learn. So, with now the national poverty rates and homelessness increasing in the United States, what do you suggest districts could do, or how could we be innovative in the context of funding structure models so that this variable of poverty does not impact future economic trends?
Yeah. You have to have a holistic vision for children. And by that, I mean, realize that the educational needs, the social needs, psychological needs are all connected. And once an educator, a leader understands that, and they understand what the needs of their students are, then they know they need partners and they need to engage the community in supporting the children. And so a partnership could be working with the church to provide mentorship for kids, particularly kids whose fathers aren't present or whose kids have parents who are incarcerated. It might be a partnership with the local hospital to make sure that some of the health needs are being met, or with a college or university, depending upon, again, the needs. Now, if you're in a city like I am, building those kinds of partnerships is easier. If you're in a rural area where those kinds of, entities are not immediately available, it's much harder. So what we have to do is think creatively and resourcefully about who are our partners, how do we build these relationships that allow us to meet the needs of kids, because the truth is schools can't do everything by themselves for kids. You can't ask a teacher to also be a social worker, and a psychologist, and a surrogate parent. We need other parties in the lives of kids if we're going to address those needs.
Absolutely. And Dr. Noguera, this is a follow-up question or a sub question to this, is that when we look at school quality, when we look at district quality, and just we rate them with these linear summative metrics, right? We don't take into consideration what I like to say the sensitive measures, the needs that you're talking about, poverty, social mobility, all of these compounding factors that play into or that come into our schools. Now, obsolete of just looking at it from a linear context of academic growth and academic achievement, how can we truly define school quality? How can we truly define organizational quality for education?
Well, you have to look at student outcomes, right? Like what are this, what are students able to do as a result of their education? What are their skills like? Where do they go? Are they going to colleges? Are they, able to improve their lives? So you need to look at outcome measures, but you also need to consider where do they start, right? If you are in a school that's serving a low income disadvantaged community, you have much greater challenges than if you're in a school serving affluent kids, right? It's a little bit like, if I'm the coach of the Lakers and I start out with LeBron and Anthony Davis, very different situation than if I'm the coach of, I don't know, you give me another team.
Please don't use our Knicks, Dr. Noguera. Please don't
Well,
use our
I'm a former Knicks fan, right? But the Knicks are looking pretty good this year, right? So
yeah, yes,
they're
they
looking a
are.
lot better. But for a long time, they weren't. You have to work with what you have. And the sign of a great team is they get players to play better together. Sign of a great school is there's growth. That just because what we know is just because kids have economic needs doesn't mean they can't learn. It means that you have to figure out, okay, how do we create conditions in the schools that allow us to meet those needs and keep the kids challenged, keep them stimulated, because excellence is possible in all communities if you get the conditions right.
Absolutely, Dr. Noguera, conditional data. I always talk about it, right? We talk about performance data, perception data, and this new data category. I'm really trying to unwrap measures conditional data for students. But we're forecasting, Dr. Noguera, obviously you know this, that 57% of public education will be Black and Brown. You're at the USC School of Education, and we, talk about teacher prep programs. We talk about, leadership programs, but how would you redefine leadership in teacher prep programs or professional learning to be more culturally responsive in learning organizations and classrooms that are aligned to this new demographic percentage of 57% being Black or Brown?
Well, and I have to say that I'm proud of the fact that not only is our student population extremely diverse, where overwhelming majority of our students are students of color and women,
Mhm.
but many of our faculty are as well. So but so it should be reflected in what they learn. That is the curriculum, the materials that they're exposed to, but also should be reflected in what we're asking them to do, our students to do with respect to how they use knowledge. We have been committed to making sure that our students, particularly those who are getting a doctorate, are doing research that's designed that aims at helping schools to improve, and that can be applied in real schools. And I'm encouraged because I meet my students all over the world. Over 80 of the superintendents in California are our graduates. I was in Ghana this year, and turns out the Minister of Education is a graduate of our school. And I was very pleased when I met with him and spoke with him. He said, a lot of what he learned to lead the Ministry of Education in Ghana, he learned in LA, he learned through USC. And so to give you an example, he doubled the enrollment of students in secondary schools in Ghana within a year.
Wow.
He said, I did that because I borrowed an idea from LA. The idea was, they said we couldn't increase enrollment because we didn't have the space. He said, let's do year-round schools. We have the same number of schools. We will rotate kids in at different times to get more kids served. And so that kind of resourcefulness, but that kind of vision is what I think we need from leaders now, because we can't wait until we solve poverty and inequality before we educate kids. We got to do it now. Got to get it done.
Absolutely, Dr. Noguera, having a steadfast vision and staying on the course, during where it could get bumpy, where, challenges can arise. But again, the pathology around the vision and staying steadfast to it. Dr. Noguera, I want to ask a question about what occurred during COVID, right? So, in the DC stage of education, I like to call it during COVID-19, it was the first time we really truly focused on families and students. For the first time in a while, standardized assessments and percentiles of students were secondary. It created new learning for all of us, specifically in the ecosystem, where there was a focus on, I like to say, the whole child, whole school, and whole community continuum. How can we continue those strategies from the DC stage of education, where some of these practices are a necessity for Generation Z and Generation Alpha?
Yeah. I mean, COVID was to me an opportunity to disrupt what wasn't working. We saw many families were overwhelmed during COVID because they were not working, they were dealing with sickness, the kids were at home and doing Zoom school, and some kids did okay under Zoom on virtual learning. A lot of kids did it, and now we're seeing the effects of many kids very far behind academically because they basically did 2 years of no education. Uh, but what we have to, I think, to me, when schools as they reopened, there was an opportunity to change things, to really center the needs of kids, to think about a more holistic vision. We knew a lot of kids were in isolation too long, and we're seeing them come back to school. They don't know how to act with other kids because the socialization didn't occur. Um, and all of that, again, reminds us of the importance of this more holistic framework. So I think the pandemic was an opportunity because, change requires disruption, right?
Yeah.
And the status quo is in many ways the biggest obstacle to change. Uh,
Absolutely.
Problem is that many schools just reopened and went back to doing the same thing they had been doing.
Yes.
And it was an opportunity lost.
Absolutely. Opportunity and challenge, right? And, paying attention to these opportunities when you talk about disruption, I always look at it in a two-part phenomena, drivers and signals, right? Focusing on those driver and signals to be able to have strategic disruption for that opportunity. But Dr. Noguera, do you feel that student outcomes or student growth is being exacerbated because of the fact that when we went back into our schools and the AC stage of education, status quo became permanent again?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, and that's one of the reasons why I think we're seeing chronic absenteeism. A
Yeah,
lot of kids and their families say, "Look, this is not appealing to me. This is not attractive." Um, and what are we trying to get kids come back to?
right.
Where's the joy in learning? Where's the support kids need? So I think that because we missed that opportunity, now we're struggling with getting kids back in the building, getting kids performance back up, and I think we still have a chance to change it. We don't have to go back to the way it was. And some families are saying, "Look, I'd rather do homeschooling now than send my kids at all, or opt for something different altogether." So if public schools are going to stand a chance of staying viable, they're going to have to really think, how do we become more responsive to the needs of the students we serve?
Unbelievable. More responsive to the needs of the students that we serve. Dr. Noguera, that is compelling because I always say this when I keynote nationally and internationally is that Generation Alpha, Generation Z, their everyday lived experience is with Netflix, but then they matriculate into education institutions that operationalize themselves as Blockbuster. So we already got it. We already have a design gap right there. And Capella, when you said with the chronic absenteeism, which I concur with that, we need to get our kids strategically and fundamentally engaged. But last question, Dr. Noguera, you made VFB all the way through, but what 3 words do you want today's audience to leave our podcast episode with regards to equitable reimagination processes to create a pathway of excellence and equity in the AC stage of education?
Well, I would start with engagement that you mentioned, and think about engagement is multidimensional. It's behavioral. Our kids in it? Are they involved? Are they actively learning? But it's also cognitive. Do they understand what they're doing? Are they making connections? And it's emotional. Do they care about it? Are they passionate? And if you focus on engagement, what you end up doing is you create schools that where kids are taught the way they learn instead of being expected to learn the way teachers teach, right?
Yeah.
Too many schools, there's a lot of passive learning, kids sitting and listening to a teacher talking. And most kids don't learn that way. You talked about Netflix. A lot of kids are on YouTube, right? And because YouTube teaches you how to do things, and it's more interactive. And that's where a lot of kids learn. So the first word is engagement. The second word is we need to tap into curiosity. We know that curiosity, kids are naturally curious when they're small. They want to learn. They want to know. We also know that if you cultivate curiosity in a person, they will become self-motivated as learners because they'll keep seeking knowledge. They'll keep seeking answers to questions. Self-motivated people get control over their own education. And that's what we should be after. Kids who don't have to be told what to think or told what to read, they're seeking it on their own. And that's really a byproduct of curiosity, of that natural desire to learn. So curiosity is critical. And the third thing that's critical is hope. You have to have a sense that through education, you can create a better life for yourself and your family, that you can address the problems facing your communities, facing the world. We need to instill hope, but hope can't just be based on some naive kind of promise. It has to be based on something real. It has to be based on a genuine feeling that I have some degree of control over my life and I can use knowledge and education to make my life better. When you bring those 3 things together, I believe those are the ingredients for success in education.
Thank you for that, Dr. Noguera. Multidimensional engagement, cultivating curiosity, and instilling hope, the ingredients for success. Dr. Noguera, as I stated at the outset, it was such an honor to have you on Voices for Excellence and the opening episode for our Black Excellence series during the month of February, celebrating Black History Month.
Well, it's an honor to be with you, Michael. And, it's good that you're focusing on excellence in Black History Month. I try to remind people that when slavery ended in this country, the first thing that formerly enslaved people wanted was education.
Absolutely.
We created schools. We sought it out because we knew that it was the key to freedom. An educated person can't be controlled by someone else. And that was true then, and it's still true now. So for Black History Month, this is, I think, a perfect theme. So thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Noguera. And if my audience, if they have any questions, how would they be able to reach you via email?
Yep, they can send me email at USC, rasier.dean@usc.edu.
Dr. Noguera, again, such a pleasure and an honor. Listen, I'm up here in New York. It's 33 degrees. I remember you left me over here and you went all the way out to LA to enjoy the sun. But again, like I said, I'll never forget when you took my meeting, 2009, when I was developing my literature review. You still look good, Doc.
Thank you, Mike. You're looking good too. Thanks,
absolutely. Thank you, Doc. And on that note, onward and upward, everybody. Have a great evening.